rehearsing and I was trying to play Mars. And then the next day, Tony went in, and that's how Black Sabbath came about.
When people talk about Black Sabbath, the first name that usually comes up is Ozzy Osbourne, the man who screamed into the darkness like a demon finally unleashed. But behind that scream, buried deep beneath the sludge-thick bass lines and lyrics that sent shivers down an entire generation's spine, stood a man who was anything but loud. Not rebellious, not shocking. A quiet bassist whose every written word seemed to voice the truths the world was too afraid to say. Geezer Butler wasn't the one who shaped Sabbath's sound. That was Tony Iommi. Nor was he the band's public face. That was Ozzy. But he was the brain, the brooding soul behind it all, the man who penned the very first lyrics that opened the gates to heavy metal, where religion, war, apocalypse, and the collapse of modern morality were no longer whispered about, but screamed into the ears of millions of lost youth. For more than 50 years, Geezer stood firm, silent, precise, and uncompromising. Without scandal or flashy fame, he let his lyrics and bass lines speak of a world coming apart, of people consumed by fear, of souls that were never truly heard. He wasn't the metal god. He was the one who wrote its soul. Early life. Before writing about darkness, Geezer Butler lived in it. He was born on July 17, 1949, in Aston, a poor suburb of Birmingham, where black smoke from factories covered the sky, where the hammering of steel replaced bird song, and where childhood was bound to the harshness of heavy industry. The Butler family had 7 children, all crammed into a 2-bedroom house. Every loaf of bread had to be shared, every thin blanket stretched to fend off the cold seeping through cracked windows. His father worked himself to exhaustion at a car factory, coming home with calloused hands but wages too meager to feed so many mouths. In a home with no heating, no washing machine, and no far-off dreams, Geezer quickly learned to see the world through shadowed eyes. Poverty was not his only fear. From an early age, Geezer felt haunted by the specter of nuclear war. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962, the 13-year-old lost sleep for weeks, convinced a single bomb could wipe out the planet in an instant. "I was so terrified I couldn't sleep. I thought the end of the world could come at any moment," he later recalled. That anxiety never faded. Instead, it rooted deep in his psyche, becoming one of the lifeblood sources of his later music. Dark, foreboding, always carrying a sense of impending doom. At school, Geezer felt even more out of place. While other boys obsessed over football and showing off their strength, the thin, bookish child buried himself in reading. That made him an easy target for bullying. But books were his only escape. In Gothic literature, he found haunting imagery. In existential philosophy, unanswered questions, and in the Bible, contradictions that gnawed at him. On one hand, he was drawn to the image of God and the Catholic faith instilled by his family. On the other, he doubted. Why would an all-powerful being allow such suffering? This inner conflict later became the DNA of his lyrics. Questions of evil, fate, and the darkness of human nature. At one point, Geezer even considered becoming a priest. Not out of hunger for religious authority, but because he thought it might be the only path to peace. But Aston had no room for dreams. Around him was only steel, smoke, and poverty. And gradually, another escape flickered to life. Music. Music came to him like a crack in the iron wall, the one thing that could transform fear, loneliness, and apocalyptic dread into another language. He first played guitar but found it too common. When a friend invited him to play bass for a small local band, he picked it up, and unexpectedly, he found himself. From the abandoned dream of priesthood to the decision to embrace the bass, Geezer Butler had crossed an invisible threshold. From a child who lived in darkness to a man who wrote music for the darkness. He could not yet know that memories of the freezing house, the fear of the end of the world, and sleepless nights filled with unanswerable questions would become the raw material shaping one of the darkest bands in rock history, Black Sabbath. Early career. No one, not even Geezer Butler himself, ever thought he would become a musician. As a teenager, he had no dreams of the stage, no band posters on his wall, and no desire to join the wave of rock-loving youth spreading across England. All he knew was that he was suffocating, because the world outside was full of poverty, because God remained silent to his prayers, and because his mind was consumed by the fear of nuclear war. In 1966, at the age of 17, Geezer abandoned his dream of becoming a priest. Once a devout boy who memorized scripture and believed in salvation, he lost faith as the Vietnam War raged and the British government slashed welfare, leaving working-class families like his to struggle alone. He watched friends leave school for the factories, children in the neighborhood starving, fathers drunk and beating their wives in the street, and he asked, if God exists, where is he? With no answer, Geezer filled the void with sound. He bought a cheap guitar, learned by ear from blues records, his hands trembling, but for the first time, finding a way out. The turning point came when he met Ozzy Osbourne, a fellow Aston boy, notorious for mischief, petty theft, and school expulsions, but with a voice that was raw, raspy, and capable of cutting through the air. They discovered a strange kinship and formed the band Rare Breed. Soon after, joined by Tony Iommi, guitar, and Bill Ward, drums, they created the Polka Tulk Blues Band. At first, the band played blues rock covers in rundown Birmingham pubs, where the smell of beer mixed with smoke and audiences barely paid attention. They played simply to play. No money, no fame, just the faint hope that music could save them from factory life. But everything changed one evening in 1969. That night, Geezer saw a poster for the Italian horror film Black Sabbath, 1963, outside a cinema across from their rehearsal space. He turned to Tony Iommi and said a line that seemed offhand, but was fateful. It's strange. People pay to be scared, and here we are trying to make them happy. That single remark changed everything. The band renamed itself Black Sabbath and resolved to write music not to entertain, but to confront humanity's deepest fears. Geezer, who had lived his entire childhood haunted by visions of the apocalypse and spiritual conflict, became the principal lyricist. He didn't write about love or summer like other bands of the time. He wrote about nuclear war, lost souls, the decay of faith, and inner emptiness. At first, Geezer still played guitar, but when the group needed a bassist, he volunteered. That seemingly small decision sparked a revolution. Geezer transformed the bass from a background instrument into a parallel voice, sometimes rumbling, sometimes menacing, sometimes like the footsteps of an invisible army. While Iommi's riffs drove the weight of the songs, Geezer's bass built the atmosphere, laying the ground for Ozzy's wails. In February 1970, Black Sabbath released their self-titled debut, and it hit the world like a sudden storm. While many British bands still sang about love, light, and springtime, Sabbath delivered music that was black, cold, and haunting. Tracks like NIB and Behind the Wall of Sleep, with lyrics by Geezer, were steeped in inverted religious imagery, mysticism, and existential dread. The British press sneered, calling it the devil's music, but the youth recognized it as truth, the truth of a world trembling under war and injustice. Just months later, they released Paranoid, 1970, the album that catapulted Black Sabbath from a pub band to a global phenomenon. With War Pigs, Geezer exposed the crimes of governments and war profiteers. With Iron Man, he told the story of a betrayed hero. With Electric Funeral, he painted a vision of Earth disintegrating in a nuclear firestorm. This was not just rock. It was an indictment set to sound, written by the same boy who had once lost sleep during the Cuban Missile Crisis. By the end of 1970, as Paranoid climbed the charts in both the UK and the US, the world realized one thing: rock had gained a new language. Dark, philosophical, ferocious. And at the heart of it was not the singer or the guitar soloist, but Geezer Butler, the man who put into words what no one else dared to sing. Career success. When Black Sabbath entered the 1970s, they had, almost by accident, given birth to an entirely new form of music, heavy metal. And among Tony Iommi's steel riffs, Ozzy Osbourne's haunting voice, and Bill Ward's pounding drums, it was Geezer Butler, quietly standing behind his bass, who defined the band's soul. He was not only the one keeping rhythm, but the scriptwriter of the whole journey, as nearly all of the lyrics on their classic albums came from his dark imagination and religious obsessions. In 1971, Master of Reality was released, immediately setting a milestone for Sabbath. The lyrics of Sweet Leaf were an open tribute to marijuana. No metaphor, no disguise, just a collective confession. Yet behind that praise was a longing for escape, reflecting the mindset of a whole generation of young Britons suffocating after war and economic collapse. In Children of the Grave, Geezer's bass became more than rhythm. It was a drumbeat of urgency, calling youth to rise against silence. It remains one of Sabbath's anthems on stage, with tens of thousands screaming along, as if in a protest cloaked in darkness. In 1972, Volume 4 marked the band's first cracks as cocaine began to take hold of their lives. Yet amid the chaos, Geezer wrote some of their most chilling lyrics. Snowblind was a raw confession of drug dependence, seductive yet foreboding destruction. Meanwhile, Changes was its opposite, a gentle piano ballad soaked in loss, written as Geezer witnessed friends and loved ones falling apart. The contrast stunned fans. A band synonymous with darkness could strip itself down to such fragile emotion. By 1973, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath proved that Sabbath was more than noise. The album was more complex, musically, lyrically, and philosophically. Geezer's title track was a confession that fame and money were turning into shackles, making artists slaves to their own music. Spiral Architect went further, beyond war and religion, into cosmic questions. What is humanity in the universe, and do we matter beyond the chaos? Coupled with orchestration and progressive structures, these lyrics revealed Geezer not just as a bassist, but as a hidden philosopher disguised as a rocker. On Sabotage, 1975, with the band being manipulated by managers and personal lives crumbling, Geezer's words seethed with fury. Symptom of the Universe opened with Iommi's riff, but Geezer's bass turned it into a relentless march, a blueprint for thrash metal later embraced by Metallica and Slayer. For Sabbath, it showed they could still innovate even while drowning in drugs and lawsuits. By the late 1970s, Sabbath was losing direction. Technical Ecstasy, 1976, and Never Say Die, 1978, lacked creative unity. Geezer's lyrics in this era were less prophetic, more weary and bitter. Then, in 1979, Ozzy Osbourne was fired. For many fans, it felt like the end. Yet Geezer preserved the band's soul through his lyrics when Ronnie James Dio joined. Heaven and Hell, 1980, was the clearest proof. Children of the Sea told of a generation stripped of faith, die young, warned of youth's fleeting nature, and the title track wrestled with good and evil, light and darkness, on a new philosophical scale. Dio may have been the new voice, but the spirit remained Geezer's, shaping personal anguish into universal statements. Through the 1980s, Sabbath rotated vocalists, from Dio to Ian Gillan, Glenn Hughes, and Tony Martin. But each time Geezer returned, his lyrics remained the backbone. On Mob Rules, 1981, Sign of the Southern Cross evoked despair in a chaotic world, while Falling Off the Edge of the World sounded like a personal confession. No matter the lineup changes, one constant remained. Geezer wrote about the darkness of humanity as though he had walked through it himself. Outside Sabbath, Geezer pursued solo projects. Plastic Planet, 1995, under the name GZR, plunged into industrial metal, where he wrote about artificial intelligence, technology, and corruption. Drive-Boy Shooting pulsed with the influence of 9-Inch Nails, while Giving Up the Ghost punched at the stagnation of rock. With Black Science, 1997, he dove deeper into social disconnection and modern anxieties. These were not bestsellers, but they showed Geezer never stopped experimenting, daring to step out of Sabbath's shadow to chase his personal obsessions. Another milestone was Heaven and Hell, the supergroup reuniting Dio, Iommi, and Vinny Appice. Their album, The Devil You Know, 2009, wasn't chasing markets but serving as an artistic farewell. Bible Black was a blasphemous psalm, where Geezer mined the tension between faith and collapse. For metal fans worldwide, it proved that even in his twilight years, Geezer could still write lyrics that made listeners shiver. Looking back, from 1970 to the 2000s, Geezer Butler was always the secret soul of heavy metal. If Tony Iommi created the sound and Ozzy or Dio gave it voice, it was Geezer who laid its philosophical and spiritual foundation. He didn't sing lead, he wasn't the star, but every one of Sabbath's greatest songs, War Pigs, Iron Man, Children of the Grave, Heaven and Hell, Bible Black, bore his imprint. Black Sabbath could exist without Ozzy, even without Dio. But without Geezer Butler, heavy metal might have remained just a heavy branch of blues rock, never becoming the global culture of darkness it is today. Turmoil and shadows. No soul passes through darkness without scars. For Geezer Butler, those scars were not on his skin, but deep in his mind, silent, smoldering, like a bass note that never fades. On stage, he was the one weaving Black Sabbath's bleak soundscape. But when the lights went out, he often returned to being a small, fragile man, curled up alone in a hotel room. No lights, no music, no conversation. In Into the Void, he confessed that there were nights when he just stared at the ceiling and asked himself, "What the hell am I doing here?" The death of his father in the 1980s was a devastating blow. For someone already fragile, that loss dragged him into a deep depression. Tours, once an outlet for his energy, became a burden. New songs no longer carried the voice within. Geezer quietly withdrew from Sabbath, No announcement, no scandal, no explanation. He simply vanished. He sought healing by stepping away from music, living reclusively in Los Angeles, spending his days reading Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre, painting, gardening, and writing novels no one ever read. What had once been an escape became a door he no longer dared to open. But the darkness was not only in his mind. In 2015, Geezer was unexpectedly arrested at the Corkscrew Saloon in California after a bar fight. He was charged with assault, disorderly conduct, and vandalism. The news shocked the public, not because of the severity, but because it came from the man considered the gentlest member of Sabbath. Geezer never explained, and police never released details. Only one vague truth remained. Sometimes the darkness inside him was too great to stay hidden behind a bass guitar or pages of philosophy. Geezer Butler's true tragedy was not a bar fight, a bout of depression, or even an arrest. It was the feeling of being forgotten within the very band he helped create. While Ozzy Osbourne became an icon and Tony Iommi was hailed as the soul of Sabbath, Geezer, the man who wrote over 90% of the lyrics, who etched into rock history visions of war, death, and apocalypse, was often pushed into the shadows. Even during the 2011 to 2017 reunion, when Bill Ward was left out, Geezer remained silent in public. But in his memoir, his disappointment was clear. I used to think I was part of a family. But then I realized I was just a necessary link, nothing more. He never fought for the spotlight, never demanded recognition, never shouted when overlooked. But that silence was not peace. It was a thin armor that let him survive in a world too loud, hiding wounds he didn't want touched. And sometimes the things never spoken aloud are the loudest screams of all. Personal life. Love in the world of rock usually comes with noise, lavish weddings, loud divorces, and scandals splashed across tabloids. But Geezer Butler was different. His private life was as quiet as the way he stood behind his bass. Few words, no display, but unshakably steady. He met Gloria Butler in the early 1980s at a time when Black Sabbath had already endured storms, and he himself carried many inner wounds. To the public eye, Gloria was just an ordinary woman. No glamour, no craving for spotlight. Yet it was precisely that ordinariness that became a safe haven for Geezer, a man haunted by darkness and loneliness. They loved each other quietly, no grand declarations, no need for spectacle. Geezer found in Gloria a rare kind of understanding. She didn't need him to shout, didn't need him to pretend to be strong. When they married, they kept it private. No reporters, no extravagant party. Their marriage was like a silent vow. To be together not for the world's recognition, but so that both could breathe in a world too suffocating. Gloria was not only a wife, she became his manager, advisor, and timekeeper. In the times when he sank into depression, doubted himself, or considered walking away from music, Gloria was the one who pulled him back. She traveled with him on tour, quietly stood backstage, helped him choose a quiet home in Los Angeles so they could escape the chaos. In his hardest moments, she was not just emotional support. She was the anchor that kept him connected to the world. What bound them together further was a shared love, their love for cats. Over the years, Geezer cared for dozens of them, seeing them as the truest friends he had. In a rare conversation, he admitted, "There are days when I can't get out of bed, but the sound of cats' paws walking across the room reminds me that I'm still alive. No parties, no flashy cars, no ostentatious mansions. Geezer chose a simple life. He read philosophy, delved into Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Sartre. He painted, wrote unpublished drafts of novels. He practiced meditation as a way to heal a mind that had touched the depths of depression more than once. While Ozzy Osbourne, his fellow Aston native and former bandmate, always staged outrageous antics to demand the world's attention, Geezer chose seclusion so he could simply be himself. When asked if he ever regretted not being the most prominent one in Black Sabbath, he replied plainly, "Not everyone needs to stand in the spotlight to live true." Geezer and Gloria had no children. They rarely spoke about it, but both seemed content with the choice. For Geezer, family did not need to be defined by children. It could be the cats, the backyard garden, a room full of books, and above all, a woman patient enough to sit beside him through every high and low. In a world where shouts and screams often dominate, Geezer Butler chose to love and live to a quieter rhythm. Not everyone understood him, but he never asked them to. Because sometimes happiness is not about being recognized by the world. It is about having one person, one home, so that he no longer has to live in the dark alone. Legacy and influence. Without Geezer Butler, heavy metal may still have been born, but it would never have had the same depth. In a genre often dismissed as loud, violent, and mindless, it was Geezer's lyrics, quiet, razor-sharp, and deeply introspective, that turned metal from an outburst into an ideology. For over 50 years, he wrote about fear, loneliness, apocalypse, anti-war rage, religious disillusionment, and the alienation of living in a dishonest world. And it was these very subjects, ones nobody seemed to want to hear, that ended up saving an entire generation of young people who could only find themselves in darkness. They didn't need hollow love songs. They needed an explanation, or at the very least, someone brave enough to ask the question. In a 2023 interview with Rolling Stone, Geezer said bluntly, "I wasn't trying to write hits. I just wrote about what kept me awake at night. War, fake religion, deception. That's what I saw every day in the poor neighborhood I grew up in. And if I didn't write it down, I'd go mad." His quiet but piercing style left a direct mark on the greatest bass players of the next generation. Cliff Burton of Metallica once said in his final Guitar World interview in 1986, "Geezer is the reason I believed bass could lead the story. Not just keep time, but narrate the nightmare." It wasn't just musicians. The entire metal community eventually came to view those early Black Sabbath records as black psalms of the modern era. In Heaven and Hell, Geezer explored the line between morality and desire. In Children of the Grave, he issued a rallying cry for youth to rise when the adults stayed silent. These weren't just lyrics. They were the language of awakening. His memoir, Into the Void, released in 2023, wasn't just a retrospective. It was a confession and a final explanation for the millions of metal fans who once found pieces of themselves in his shadowy words. At a book signing in Los Angeles, Geezer bowed his head before a crowd of readers and said quietly, "I was once a kid no one listened to. And I wrote so that kids like that wouldn't have to stay silent the way I did." New York Times, 2023. No fanfare, no shock value. Geezer Butler's legacy lives in silence, but it is irreplaceable. He didn't just help shape heavy metal, he gave it a soul, an identity, and a collective memory for those who have never truly belonged anywhere else. Present life. No more long tours. No more bass lines shaking the stage or thousands of eyes following his every move. In his 70s, Geezer Butler has finally stopped. Not because the fire burned out, but because he found what he had been searching for his entire life: true silence. Today, he lives with his wife, Geezer Butler, in Nevada, where the desert stretches to the horizon and the ground no longer trembles with the sound of metal. Life now is simple: reading philosophy, tending to his garden, painting, and meditating. But beneath this quiet life, 2024 and 2025 marked a silent yet deeply meaningful chapter for Geezer and for the history of Black Sabbath. In June 2024, Geezer gave a rare interview to WRIF Radio, revealing that Into the Void, his memoir, wasn't written for fans, but for his grandchildren. "I always wanted to rewrite my life, not as the press once told it, but as a message, so the kids could know who their grandfather really was." WRIF Radio interview, June 2024. That same year, he made a surprise appearance on stage with the Foo Fighters in Birmingham, stunning the rock world. No announcement, no declaration. Geezer just walked on stage, smiled faintly, and played like he had never left. But it was all a prelude to an irreplaceable moment in 2025, a reunion concert titled Back to the Beginning at Villa Park, Birmingham, on July 5, 2025. For the first time since 2005, Geezer Butler, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, and Bill Ward stood on stage together, right where they were born. Before the show, Geezer told The Guardian, "I had a dream where we turned to dust. Everything just dissolved right there on stage. Maybe I'm afraid that this final time would leave me with nothing to hold on to." The Guardian, May 2025. But that night, nothing dissolved. There was only music, complete, ferocious, and deeply moving, like a farewell without words. Geezer didn't say much during the show. He just bowed, embraced each bandmate, and stepped back, as he had always entered, silently, humbly, needing no applause. Just weeks later, the world was shaken by the news of Ozzy Osbourne's passing on July 22, 2025, and as always, Geezer didn't deliver a long eulogy. On Instagram, he simply wrote, "Goodbye, old friend. 4 kids from Aston. Glad we got to do it one last time." Instagram, July 2025. He later published a heartfelt tribute in the Sunday Times, recounting his 57-year friendship with Ozzy. A journey not always smooth, but never broken. "I used to write words for Ozzy to sing, but that last time, I didn't need any. We just looked at each other and knew this was the best ending either of us could have hoped for." The Sunday Times, August 2025. Since then, Geezer has all but disappeared from public life. No tours, no interviews, no new albums, and yet, in the metal community, he remains like a living icon. Not because he's loud, but because he's remained true to himself, unwaveringly. He may never have stood center stage, but through a life of quiet resilience, writing from the heart, and playing bass as if translating the loneliness of a generation, Geezer Butler has proven one thing: peace doesn't come when you defeat the darkness. It comes when you learn how to walk with it, one note at a time. Geezer Butler never needed a monument. He didn't chase the spotlight, didn't hunger for fame, didn't do anything to become an icon. He simply wrote quietly about the things that made him tremble, about a world riddled with deceit, about the exhaustion of faith, and about a fear too deep to name. He was the soul of Black Sabbath, not through screams, but through the silences between drum beats. He wrote the lyrics that made a lost generation feel a little less alone. He chose to live quietly so that no one else would have to stay silent the way he once did. And in the end, as the stage faded and his bandmates slowly departed, Geezer remained, simple, clear-eyed, and faithful to the darkness inside him. He never needed praise. He never needed to be called a hero. Only one sentence needed to echo through the quiet night. I listened. I understood. And I'm still here. And what about you? Have you ever found a piece of yourself in a Black Sabbath song? Share your most memorable moment with Geezer Butler or a message of thanks for the man who gave darkness a voice. Leave a comment below. And if this story deserves to be heard, hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the ones to come. Thank you for staying with us to the very end.